Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Our topic today is private military and security companies. Our conversation will cover the reasons why private military contractors have become so pervasive in military and political hotspots around the globe. My guest today is Dr. Charles Mahoney. Dr. Mahoney is an assistant professor of political science. Welcome, Charles, and thank you for joining us again on Talking Points. I say again because you were here with us once before, but it's good to have you back.
Thanks, Dave. I'm happy to be here again.
Well, let's start the conversation by talking about what we mean by private military companies. We know that historically, private military companies have been used over the ages. If we go to the Revolutionary War here in America, the small states of Germany, when Germany was a loose confederation of states, would rent out their militias or their armies for use by the British and King George III. So we had Hessians, as they were called then. Today, we're talking about something different. They're not really fighting on the battlefield, at least the U.S. contractors are not. They're more in support roles, logistics, security, providing intelligence services, and so on. So how did this really get started in terms of the modern form of military contracting? I think it goes back to the 1960s.
Right. Well, mercenaries have been part of warfare for almost the entirety of human history. Kings, feudal lords, city-states in Italy in the Middle Ages. As you mentioned, in the Revolutionary War, the British hired Hessian troops to fight against the American revolutionaries, the colonists. So mercenaries have been part of warfare for a long period of time. Recently, and specifically since the end of the Cold War, we've had the emergence of private military corporations. These are corporate entities, companies, who are structured like modern corporations we see today, something like Apple, Microsoft, GE, whose primary motivation is profit and who contract legally with governments to operate in the field of battle. The primary distinction between mercenaries and private military corporations is that mercenaries are involved in direct combat with the adversary. They're basically fighting in the vanguard of a conflict. Private military corporations, for the most part, are providing support, logistical support, assistance, consulting, training to governments around the world to supplement or support the conflict that is happening.
And just to pick it up again, the historical thread, in the 1960s there was a company called WatchGuard International that was formed by some British Special Air Services officers to provide surveillance and training and so on. And from there it grew. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. was hiring contractors to do engineering services and construct buildings and so on in the 60s. And then in the 1990s, as you said, there was an explosion of this kind of military contracting because of the end of the Cold War. We didn't need the troop numbers that we had during the Cold War because the imminent threat wasn't there. So that left a bit of a gap in some cases in terms of the need for security. And from what I understand, there were about 6 million former military personnel in Western countries, from NATO to the United States and so on, who were out of a job, essentially, because of this. So why would someone who's out of a job decide to pursue a career in military contracting?
Well, yeah, as you said, modern private military corporations formed actually during the Cold War. We have the example of WatchGuard and other small examples in the 70s and 80s. But the 1990s is really when we see this explosion of private military corporations with companies like Executive Outcomes, Sandline International being two of the most infamous. Why did this occur? Well, after the Cold War, governments were reducing military spending. So we see this glut of labor in the marketplace. Former troops, special forces personnel who were basically out of a job. And what had they been trained to do? They'd been trained to fight and to engage in warfare. And so we have this supply of labor on the market. And even though governments aren't as worried, Western governments aren't as worried about warfare as they used to be, smaller countries that are involved in civil war, in internal conflict, are still in need of military consulting, advising, and fighting in some instances. And so we have demand, which is for force, which is staying the same or even rising in a lot of cases, and this increased supply, and it's sort of a natural relationship that happens. And so we have this emergence, this boom of private military corporations at this time.
We should probably define what we mean by private military corporation or private security company. As far as the U.S. is concerned, what are we hiring these companies to do for us?
Okay, so for the United States, these companies are providing a range of services. They might be involved in protecting State Department officials. They might be involved in training the police force or the armies of other countries. Specifically, we think of examples like Iraq and Afghanistan. And they're also providing logistics support. That is the communications infrastructure for the American military. They're building bases overseas. They're managing those bases. They're providing food for the troops. They're doing the troops' laundry in a lot of instances. So they really are the sort of the bones of the military. And what we have now is, in the United States, is a hybrid military. That is, the American armed forces, the Department of Defense, are involved in the tactical fighting operations, but all the logistics that go into making a military go and allow them to perform the operations they want to perform are provided by these private for-profit corporations. What they're not doing is actually fighting for the most part. We think of examples like Blackwater and other companies providing protection services actually engaged in fighting, and for the most part around the world, they're not doing that. If they were doing that, they'd be illegal and actually be mercenaries, not private military corporations.
So with these private military corporations, they obviously answer to a corporate structure. That's why they're a corporation or a company. And so they're looking at the bottom line, which is revenue. And so they have the goal of generating as much business and charging as much as they can for those services. That may not be what the government is looking for, the U.S. government. The U.S. government is looking for services that they can afford that will provide the highest quality possible. So those goals aren't exactly parallel.
Right, what we have here is a classic principal-agent dilemma. The agent, which in this case is a private military corporation, their primary motivation is to make profit. So they're trying to provide a service at the lowest cost possible. The government, on the other hand, or whoever the principal is, because these companies contract not only with governments but with international organizations, with multinational corporations, they're looking for the highest quality service possible. And these two interests don't always coincide. The company trying to make a profit is trying to do it at the lowest cost structure possible, but the government wants the highest quality service possible, and that's not always possible when companies are trying to reduce costs.
And as I think you mentioned or alluded to a moment ago, we have private military and security companies working for both the Pentagon or the Defense Department, but we also have them providing security for the State Department and protecting embassies and protecting diplomats and so on. But we ran into some trouble with that in a couple of instances. First, let's talk about Blackwater. You mentioned Blackwater a few minutes ago. Blackwater was involved in protecting, I guess, diplomats and the embassy corps and so on. In Baghdad, ran into some trouble, major trouble. 17 Iraqis were killed. They were civilians by a Blackwater convoy. What happened there, and what was the result of it ultimately?
Blackwater was protecting a convoy in Baghdad. They arrived at a location called Nisor Square, and according to all accounts, without being attacked or provoked, opened fire on a crowd of people, killing dozens of Iraqis. This was a very controversial moment in the United States counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq because it made it very difficult for the American forces to do the job they were trying to do, winning over the hearts and minds of the Iraqi population. Also, there was the question of where would these contractors be held accountable? Would they be held accountable in Iraqi courts, in military courts, or somewhere else? Well, they're not military personnel, they're civilians, so they weren't subject to American military law. The United States government had reached an agreement with the Iraqi government that they wouldn't be subject to Iraqi law. So ultimately, the Blackwater contractors involved in this incident were held accountable in federal district court in Washington, D.C. But it took several years for them to finally be, for a trial to occur and for them to be found guilty in this instance. And this is a very rare occasion. For the most part, contractors who have violated the law in the past, who have shirked their duties, have basically been held unaccountable.
Well, as you say, the 4 members of Blackwater were convicted on, one of them was convicted on a charge of murder, the others were convicted on voluntary manslaughter and some other charges related. My understanding is, of course, this will be challenged in court. The defendants will challenge every aspect of the case. They'll even challenge whether the U.S. Justice Department had jurisdiction over this case since it was a military war zone and so forth. And so we see these kinds of problems, gray areas. Talk a little bit about the gray areas that exist in these military zones.
Right, that is, what is the legal jurisdiction that these contractors operate under? Should they be subject to military law, the law of the country that they're operating in, or United States law, or international law, right? And for the most part, they sort of try and avoid being responsible in any jurisdiction. It's to their advantage, and it's very difficult to try them in any specific area. Ultimately, they are private corporations, mainly based in the United States, and so what has occurred is that when the United States government has found that they have broken the law, shirked their duties, they try and find them responsible, take them to court in the United States. This is very difficult, though. The United States legal system has a high level of proof that you have to present to bring people to trial, to find them guilty, and then a very lengthy appeal system. The entire process takes a long period of time. And so these private corporations are aware of this situation and take advantage of it. And in a way, it's a way for them to avoid being held accountable under any jurisdiction. And this is a major problem because if they can't be held accountable in any location, they can often operate with impunity.
That's a good point for us to stop for the break because we're coming up on that break. And stay with us when we come back after the break. We'll talk about accountability and also how the market for force affects the market for force. We'll explain what that means when we come back.
What does graphic design look like 20 years from now? Does GIFs, flat design, or ultra minimal aesthetic mean anything to you? How about the idea that language isn't as effective as images, hyperlinks, or perhaps emoticons? Graphic design is changing rapidly. You can become a part of this exciting career field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly. My guest today is Dr. Charles Mahoney, and we're talking about private military and security companies. Charles, before we went to the break, we were talking about accountability, and we were talking about Blackwater and the trial that they went through and holding them accountable for the actions that took place in Baghdad in 2007. I have another example of security provided for an embassy. It's the Benghazi compound in Libya that we know was attacked on September 11th of 2012. What happened there was the State Department had hired a company called Blue Mountain Group, and Blue Mountain Group was a relatively small company. It's headquartered in Wales in the British Isles. They were hiring local men off the street in Libya to provide security and protection for the embassy. Problem was they weren't really screening, they weren't really training, they were just hiring guys off the streets who were then patrolling with flashlights and batons, no guns. And this is what one of the commanders of the Guard Force said. This was in a Reuters news service article that I thought was interesting. The Libyan commander in charge of the local guards at the mission was a former English teacher who said he heard about Blue Mountain from a neighbor. I don't have a background in security, he said. I've never held a gun in my life, speaking on condition of anonymity out of fear for his safety. And when hired, the commander said he was told, "You have great English and get along well with everyone, and you're punctual. We want you to be a guard commander." So I guess as long as you speak English well, you get along with everybody, and you show up on time, you can be a guard commander. Where's the accountability with that?
Well, here we see the classical principal agent problem in the contracting situation. The contractor, Blue Mountain, wanted to have as low a cost structure as it possibly could. So therefore, instead of hiring former special agent troops from the UK or the United States, it hired locals who were not trained, obviously because they could pay them less money. So in the company's interest, it was to have as low a cost structure as possible to increase profits. From the State Department's perspective and the United States government perspective, obviously they would have wanted the company to hire the best contractors that they could, people who had been trained in protection, risk analysis, and also evacuation procedures, right? They should have planned for the consulate being attacked and had a set procedure ready to evacuate the personnel. This appears as something that the group didn't do. And so you see the interests of the principal, the U.S. government, opposite or opposed to the interests of the corporation.
And we can see where we have tragic consequences when those things occur. Let's talk about accountability. I teased before the break that we would talk about how the market for force would affect, or how the marketplace would affect the market for force. And if we talk about the marketplace, we usually find that we have buyers and we have sellers. Obviously, that's basic economics. But in this case, the buyer tends to be the U.S. government that we're talking about. Is that a good thing that they are a buyer, and is it best if they're consolidating all of the government resources into that one buyer structure?
Yeah, the major buyer for the services provided by private military corporations around the world is the United States government. Now, there are also many other purchasers of these services. There are states like the United Kingdom, France, Israel, South Africa. There are international governmental organizations like the United Nations, NGOs, and multinational corporations. But the United States government is the major buyer of these services. And what does that do? It gives them some leverage over these corporations. In some specific industries, the United States government is what we call a monopsony, the only buyer or major buyer of a specific service. And this is sort of the reverse of a monopoly. And in this instance, the buyer has a lot of power over the providers of the service. So in most of those industries where contractors have to contract with the U.S. government is able to exert a lot of oversight and leverage on those contractors because they'd be worried that if they did a bad job, shirked their duties, there's no other buyer in the market, and the United States would replace them with another provider.
We should mention here that you've recently written a paper about the market forces that affect the market for force. It's under peer review now, but apparently it's going well. So I want to congratulate you on that and ask you a little bit more about this contracting process in the marketplace. You mentioned in your paper this concept of adverse selection in the process of gathering information about these private companies. What do you mean by adverse selection?
Well, firms often try and misrepresent their capabilities to the government. And it's impossible for the government to know the exact capabilities that firms can provide. So often the government, because it doesn't have complete information, or any buyer doesn't have complete information about the quality of service a firm can provide, it makes the wrong decision and picks a firm that provides low quality service, often because that firm will give a low ball bid in the contracting process. So this could have been the case with what happened in Benghazi, with a fairly small organization, Blue Mountain, being chosen to protect the consulate in Benghazi. It would be interesting to see if what the United States government perception was prior to hiring them and afterwards with respect to the services that they could provide.
Let's talk about another aspect of the marketplace when we talk about the market for force. You mentioned the oligopoly of just a few small companies, or not small, large companies. If you have just a few large companies providing these kinds of services, that can be problematic too. Why would just having a few small companies providing these services be a problem?
Right. Well, in any industry where there's only a few providers of a service, those groups have a lot of leverage over the buyers. So in the instance in the private military industry where this occurs is in the logistics industry. There are only a few companies, just a handful, who can provide large-scale logistics services to governments around the world. One of these is Kellogg Brown and Root, who provided logistics services to the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now the problem here is that if Kellogg Brown and Root does not do a good job in the industry where they're operating, there's no way to replace them with another organization. They're basically one of the only organizations that can provide the logistics services, that is building bases, maintaining bases, feeding the troops, operating convoys that transport goods and services throughout the country. There's no other organization that the United States government can replace them with. So in this oligopolistic situation, the United States government has a problem because even if the companies do a poor job, there's no substitute for them.
Well, that would lead one to the conclusion that, well, maybe we need a lot of contractors out there so that we have a choice in contractors and we'll make them compete in the so-called free market, the free market for force. But you came to some findings in your paper that maybe having too many companies isn't such a great thing either.
Right. If we have a free market and a lot of companies providing services, it can lead to this adverse selection problem. That is, the government or the principal isn't able to determine the skills and ability of the services that can be provided by corporations. So really, the best instance for principals is to have a few providers of services and to be the only buyer of those services, a monopsony situation for the government. In a situation where there's too many providers of services, a lot of misinformation and adverse selection can occur.
Let's talk about what we use those services for today. The Iraq War is essentially over except for the efforts we are undertaking now to stop ISIS. Afghanistan is probably going to wind down eventually, but we still need a lot of help in terms of intelligence gathering. What are we doing with intelligence gathering in terms of contractors? I believe Edward Snowden's name would come up.
Yeah, these companies they're private companies. They're trying to make a profit, so they see where the industry is going. And Iraq is over. Afghanistan is winding down. The services that they're providing in those areas, the demand for those may be reduced. So what they're moving into now is a lot of the intelligence market. Areas which we traditionally think would be operated by the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security. These companies are now collecting intelligence, analyzing intelligence, managing the communication systems that are used by intelligence services, and managing the infrastructure, right? And Edward Snowden was a contractor working for Booz Allen Hamilton, fairly low-level contractor. He had access to a lot of the NSA's data and was able to steal it and disseminate it around the world, as we know. So it can be a very dangerous, problematic situation when we have this hybrid setup in the intelligence area.
And I believe I read in your paper, and I hope I've quoted this accurately, but you stated that there were 37,000 individuals that have been hired by the U.S. government to provide contract intelligence services. And we're spending about $50 billion a year on this intelligence gathering with these private contractors, and that's about 70% of the intelligence budget. What about that? Is that a fair ratio for us to get involved in here in the U.S. government? And as you said, there's expertise that the U.S. government doesn't have that they need to work with contractors on because those contractors do have that expertise.
Right. The U.S. government has to contract out some services. It can't research and develop the very highest technology, equipment, and abilities that it needs to engage in the surveillance that it needs to do. So there has to be some contracting. But what's happened recently is that there's been this sort of boom in hiring private contractors in the intelligence industry. And one of the arguments about this is that it gives the government some leeway or escape route with respect to oversight. That is, it's much easier to try and investigate the government through Freedom of Information Acts, versus a private corporation who is often protected by privacy laws. So hiring these private military corporations or private intelligence corporations in the intelligence area is often a way for the government to sort of create a little space between itself, the potentially illegal activities that are being engaged in, and the court system and researchers, investigators who are trying to find out what's actually happening.
And we only have about a minute left, but needless to say that this is something that's going to continue from now on. We're in this game for the long haul.
Yes, we have basically a hybrid defense and intelligence sector at the moment. The military cannot operate without contractors. As we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were often more contractors in those two conflicts present in the theater of conflict than actual soldiers. Similarly, we talk about the intelligence budget. More of the intelligence budget is going to private corporations than is going to the traditional agencies that we think of as managing intelligence in the United States. It's going to be very difficult to go back if we want to. We're kind of going forward on this hybrid trajectory, and the United States is going to have to learn how to deal with these corporations, manage them, and hold them accountable if it wants to maintain the quality of its national defense.
Well, we've certainly turned the corner on intelligence gathering in terms of hiring these contractors. There's no going back. But I want to thank you for coming back to Talking Points for this discussion. It's always fascinating having you here. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. And thank you for watching Talking Points. Be sure to join us again for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.